Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are talking about Skyward Sword, its biggest flaw, and how that flaw may have been the basis for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Allow me to explain. It's common knowledge that Fujibayashi took the reins with Skyward Sword, with Aonuma taking more of a back seat. In this new installment, the story was front and center for the game. Giving a classic and linear Zelda experience largely meant to fill in the backstory of the games up to that point. It gave an origin for the Master Sword, told us of Goddess Hylia, and how she took the humans and made them her people. Fujibayashi would also go on to be the driving force behind Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And so, in a way, you could call these titles the Fujibayashi trilogy. However, nothing is perfect, and that is especially true when time travel is introduced to the mix. It is my belief that when Breath of the Wild was being created, that it was meant to be a reboot to correct the mistake that was made with Skyward Sword. With all that said, kick back and relax while I walk you through it. Part 1. The Time Loop. Skyward Sword is a story that uses time travel. In it, there is a time loop where Zelda goes back in time to basically set up the events of the present. Sound familiar? Unlike Tears of the Kingdom, though, there are some far more glaring mistakes in the time travel logic, particularly in the ending. To understand the mistake, we first need to run down the nature of the time loop. In the ancient past, after the Golden Goddesses had departed, their relic was left in the hands of Goddess Hylia. Demons came from a rift in search of that power. Eventually, she sealed their leader, the demon lord Demise. She knew that the seal wouldn't last forever, and so she set into motion a plan to use the Triforce to completely eradicate him. But it came at a price. For reasons unknown, only mortals can use the Triforce. Hylia was wounded from the battle, and so she decided to forego her immortality and reincarnate as a mortal so that one day she could use the Triforce to finish the job. She also had a backup plan. Her chosen knight, using her sword, guided by a spirit she infused it with, would seek out the means to make him worthy of the relic so he could use it in her place. During the events of the game, the modern Zelda and reincarnation of Hylia ends up on this journey. Hylia's plan doesn't work as she intended, and so Link takes up the goddess sword and follows her while undergoing the trials. About a third of the way through the game, she travels into the past with her protector, Impa, who destroys the gate behind them so they cannot be followed. About 2/3 of the way through the game, Link uses a second Gate of Time and finally reunites with her. It is at this point that she explains the plan laid out by Hylia, and explains that he has to use the Triforce because her role is to stay in the past and reinforce the seal on Demise. In a touching display, she then encases herself in amber. Link vows to be the one who would wake her up in the present, and so he returns to the present with the Master Sword, now blessed with her power itself, fully awakened. The time loop here is that Zelda has always been in the past encased in amber, maintaining the seal. Even early into the game, you can see these double doors with a crack in them and see the amber on the other side. This is a stable time loop, and the game very much plays on the idea that it has always been this way. There is more though. As the game progresses, Link eventually claims the Triforce and makes a wish upon it to destroy Demise. This wish is granted in the most awe-inspiring manner possible, by dropping a building on him. Anyhow, we are told by Fi that this has eradicated Demise. As the celebration is starting, Girahim shows up to ruin things by abducting Zelda and going into the past. Using her as a sacrifice, he intends to undo Hylia's seal and set his master free, all in the time before Demise was eradicated. He basically succeeds. Demise is revived, there is an epic sword fight, but in the end, Demise falls before Hylia's champion. His essence is absorbed by the Master Sword to decay, and Link leaves the sword in the past precisely for that reason. Impa stays in the past to watch over the seal and the temple, and so Zelda gives her one of her bracelets as a memento. When they return to the present, they see the old woman has the bracelet, revealing her identity as Impa. The game ends with the Hylians returning to the surface, and the foundation of what would become the Kingdom of Hyrule falling into place. Like the Emperor behind the door, Impa's bracelet too implies that this is a stable time loop. And so, what is the problem? Well, if you are a fan of my channel, you probably already know. Leaving the Master Sword in the past is the discrepancy, because it was left in front of the double doors in front of the Amber. We visit this spot multiple times. Sometimes Impa is there, sometimes she isn't. But there is never a sword there, and yet in the ancient past, there is a pedestal there for the sword. When we return to the present, the sword is still there. And so it would seem that they are in an alternate future, one in which the Master Sword was seemingly left in the past. The outcome of this has been talked about in the Zelda community a lot, and yet rarely do I see people even suggesting anything similar to my conclusion on this. I've spent a lot of time revisiting this concept, but first allow me to highlight precisely the error here. The Master Sword, simply put, should not be here if we follow the time travel logic of the Amber and the bracelet. To do so throws the entire time loop into doubt, and the plot so clearly behaves as though there is a stable time loop. As such, this is a critical error in the game's story. Now, let's talk about the consequences of that error. But first, are you enjoying the video? You might not agree with me, but I hope you at least recognize the time I put into this and will give the video a like. If you want more content from me, subscribing to the channel would be awesome too. It's free, I put out a video every week, and I respond to all my comments. Anyhow, back to the video. Part 2. The Consequences. Simply put, the act of leaving the sword in the present and it not being present earlier in the game brings the whole narrative into question. If this is meant to be a stable time loop, and the plot is absolutely structured in a way to suggest it is, then why was the Master Sword not present earlier in the game? Clearly, if it were, it would cause all types of conflict. At the core of the game, Link is trying to improve the Goddess Sword and himself. The end goal is to make himself balanced so he can use the Triforce. But at the same time, it also enhances the sword in the same manner, dousing it with the virtues of power, wisdom, and courage. The final blessing from Hylia herself brings it to its maximum state. So what would happen if, say, Link pulled the Goddess Sword, came down to the surface, and found a completed Master Sword in this precise spot? Well, frankly, he would probably try to pull it. Perhaps future Fi would speak to him, or wouldn't speak at all now being in the deep slumber. For the player, this would be a huge giveaway for what would be happening. At first, sure, they may not know that the Master Sword and the Goddess Sword are the same blade, but after the first flame, I am sure they would figure it out. I dare say though, that this actually wouldn't have been that bad. Instead of having the Master Sword pedestal here in front of the double doors, it could have been moved to the side someplace else. Over here between the save point and the spot for the tree would have worked really well. When Link goes to the past, they could simply not show the sword in it while also not calling attention to it at all. Link is there to meet with Zelda after all. At the end of the game, it would then make sense for Fi to want the sword to be put to rest, and thus the time loop would be fixed. However, this is not what Nintendo did, and so we as fans and theorists are left with the task to make sense of what happened. In addition to this situation with the sword, it has been brought up that basically there are two timelines that split from this as a result. A good future where Demise was destroyed by the Triforce and the Skyloft statue fell to the ground, and an alternate future where, somehow, the statue also fell to the ground, but Link traveled back in time and killed Demise after Zelda was abducted. It's a mess, and the story was criticized over this even back in 2011 when it came out. I didn't have a channel back then, but believe me, my friends heard me rant about this in those days. Hyrule Historia attempts to make sense of it, but at the end of the day, that book and the others put out are supplemental material that don't necessarily present the truth to what is happening. I think that when Breath of the Wild was in early development, Fujibayashi was aware of this story problem, in an interesting way of self-correcting the problem. I think he decided to double down on the concept and use it as a means of rebooting the series. No longer would the games under his control be bound by the convoluted timeline. In this way, Fujibayashi could make his game and yet be free from the restrictions of the others. A new branch of the timeline that spun off from the act of leaving the sword in the past. Let's assume for a moment that this was the case, that he wanted to use his mistake to make a new timeline, a soft reboot. If we take this stance, everything starts to make more sense. The ceremony speech talks about the different potential trials the hero might face, be it drift in time, or lost in the embers of twilight. The map references become entirely superficial. Instances from the original games are references, but not the same. Simply allusions to another timeline but different. A new interpretation of them in this new series of events. The catch is, I'm guessing Nintendo realized how much negativity reboots were getting at that time. I think that if Breath of the Wild was intended to be a soft reboot following an alternate timeline, they were told that they could not openly explain it as such, because in effect, they would be flushing decades of established lore away. Personally, I hate the idea. Many of my fellow content creators have expressed similar feelings when faced with the idea of Breath of the Wild being a reboot and continue to deny it despite the lack of hard connections to the old games. But wait, what about all the references to the past like the Zora tablets and the Cloud Barrier? I'll address some of those shortly. I do honestly believe this was the intent when they created Breath of the Wild. There are too many nods, too many concepts, that relate to the idea that Skyward Sword in particular is canon. Statements of goddesses, of history, that are both vague yet eerily specific. When Tears of the Kingdom was announced, I think everybody expected them to double down on that and give us more firm connections to the past games. Ganondorf certainly looks like he was inspired by Twilight Princess. That hand certainly looks like it could be Twilight in nature. The cave paintings show Ganondorf using a trident, just like in some of the past games. So let's talk about some of those references now. Part 3. A Timeline Unraveled. The expectations of the fans for Tears of the Kingdom were simply not met. Many of the connections to past timelines as well as Skyward Sword were walked back. Statements once made were now given alternate explanations. Here are a few off the top of my head. Princess Zelda is stated to have the bloodline of a goddess in her, and yet they reveal her ancestors were Zonai, who themselves were seen as gods. The bloodline spoken of in Breath of the Wild could simply be them recognizing her Zonai ancestry, and not, as we all assumed, a connection to goddess Hylia. A goddess, I would remind you, who is very much alive and talking to Link in the present. The Zora tablets that speak of Princess Ruto have been updated with the Sidon tablets. They now speak about how there was once a princess named Ruto who fought alongside a princess and a hero against a powerful man who wanted to conquer everything. That many Zora died and she would awaken as a sage. If we look at the ancient sage of water, could she not also be this person? She has the power of water, which is something that we know is common in the royal line. She would most certainly have been a princess if that was true. She did fight against an evil man who wanted to conquer, and that man brought much tragedy to her domain. There was a princess that she fought alongside. And couldn't Rauru, who made the ultimate sacrifice, also be seen as a hero? We can draw a conclusion that the Divine Beast pilot mask were modeled after the ancient sage's mask, and that the Divine Beast were inspired by the ancient animals present and perhaps even worshipped in those Zonai temples. If the ancient sages were the inspiration for the Divine Beast that the Sheikah built, then wouldn't it make sense for Va Ruto, Va Naboris, Va Meadow, and Va Darunia to be named after those ancient sages from the imprisoning war? In Breath of the Wild, we can see the dragons flying through the sky and piercing through what might be called a cloud barrier. Could it be the same one from Skyward Sword? It almost certainly was a reference to that in Breath of the Wild. Yet in Tears of the Kingdom, the Sky Islands become visible on the day of upheaval, and not, as many assume, at the end of the Great Sky Island tutorial. Even if what we see was meant to be some type of sky barrier, it clearly isn't the same as the one in Skyward Sword, for that one was so thick we could see no ground from the sky. And yet, if we look in the distance from the Great Sky Island at the start of the game, we can see land in the distance. This is not the cloud barrier from Skyward Sword. It is, at best, some type of cloaking technology by the Zonai to keep them hidden from the surface. I personally feel that if Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were meant to be an extension of the past games in the series, that more points of reference would have been added to strengthen that connection. Instead, it feels as though they distanced themselves from the past connections they made, and actively created new lore to cause conflict with what we were expecting. Could this be negligence? Perhaps it is just bad writing. Perhaps I, or rather we as a community, were expecting too much from the developers of a series that I'm obsessed with. But at the same time, when I look at other series that seem to care more about their lore, I don't think what I'm asking for is unrealistic. Part 4. The Future. At the time of writing this video, the developers have stated a few times that there will be no DLC for Tears of the Kingdom. Many have taken this rather poorly, not so much because they want fun new puzzles and new Zonai devices, but because there are holes in the story that we want to build. It is my hope that with the new upcoming console, a director's cut version of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom will be released. In those, I hope that there will be new content that better connects the two games, and ultimately gives a more satisfying conclusion. Do I want to buy a new console and a new version of both games for basically some DLC? No, not really. Will I? Yes, I absolutely would. Some of you might recall that with other games such as Final Fantasy XV and the Kingdom Hearts series, this has happened. More continuity inserted retroactively into enhanced versions of the game. This hasn't really happened in the Zelda games. That doesn't mean they couldn't embrace new good practices, or at least new profitable practices. Again, this is me hoping I'm allowed to do that. I'll be honest with you guys, I'm not sure how to end this video. Skyward Sword's biggest mistake was indeed the placement of the Master Sword in the ending. I believe that they tried to use that to justify a new timeline, a new series of games that spun off from it. As for the future of the Zelda series as a whole, allow me to speculate. My hope is that they would return to linear storytelling and set the games back in the base timeline, while clearly outlining where they happen. My fear is that the open-air Zelda format has been so profitable that they will feel compelled to continue with it until the next big trend in gaming comes along. Even if the next game is open world, my hope is that it doesn't continue in this iteration of Hyrule. I love this world, but I'm tired of it. I have walked these paths too many times. I know this land so well that from a glancing screenshot of the overworld and even the sky, I can narrow down the location with uncanny accuracy. My point being is that this world, these people, I want them to be put to rest. I want a new Hyrule, and above all else, I want the creators to be honest and straightforward if the upcoming games are a continuation of the past, or if they are reboots. That's all I have to say on the topic. Thanks for watching the video. I know this one seemed like a bit of a downer, but trust me, I'm not done with Zelda. I am wanting to do some non-Zelda things though, and intend to start out some more Final Friday streams. I'm planning on doing Final Fantasy VI because, well, I love that game, and I could really use some nostalgia candy right now. After Final Fantasy VI, I will probably do Final Fantasy VII Remake, getting ready for Rebirth in just a couple months. Don't worry though, I have plenty of Zelda stuff coming too. This isn't stopping anytime soon. If you haven't done so already, a like and subscribe to the channel would really help out. For those of you who can do more, joining my channel members or supporting me on Patreon would be greatly appreciated. If it wasn't for the direct support from the guys down here, I wouldn't be able to keep doing this. Joining up will give you access to my growing Discord where we can talk more directly about upcoming topics. That's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching. Be safe and may the way of the hero lead to the Triforce.